Thank you everyone for joining us this morning and welcome to what hopefully you'll find an engaging and informative session around arguably one of the trickiest subjects on any of these transformation programs, data, both data migration, data governance and control. A few quick pointers around the platform that we're using today in case you're not familiar with it. There is a chat function, both private and public. It would be great to hear from you, so feel free to say hello, raise a question. We'll do our best to answer them live, or failing that, we'll reach out to you after the session with a specific answer. In today's session, we wanted to share with you some of the key learnings we felt were important for the entire program to be aware of if you were not a data person, which might not be obvious to you. So if you're perhaps running an SAP program, involved in one of the other work streams or seconded to one, these are some of, we think, the key pitfalls around data that you should be aware of. For those of you not familiar with us, with Limelight, we're a small boutique consultancy. It's our job to help organizations deliver benefits quickly and make sure programs both cost effective and deliver the outcomes that are aspired to safely and securely. But enough about us. Before we get started, and by way of introductions, there's going to be three of us presenting today. So perhaps if I kick off and introduce myself, I'm Brian Lavery. I'm one of the executive directors at Limelight Consulting. I've been doing these business transformation programs, usually always enabled by SAP for just over 20 years. And I guess the thing that really fires me up, that keeps me going in these programs, is trying to make sure that the business aspirations are truly realized, that they're not lost along the way, and the outcomes the business are striving to achieve, the change management that's required to enable that is in place and makes the journey worthwhile, and not as I said, lost through the journey, which can be convoluted at times. Perhaps if I can ask my two other co-presenters, Neil and Gordon, to introduce themselves. Perhaps Neil, starting with you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this session this morning. So I think a lot of people hopefully might know me as well, looking at the names on the list. Great to see you all. My name is Neil Howe. I'm part of the exec team at Limelight. I've been doing transformation work for 20 years or so. And I guess my kind of mantra for these type of programs is always to get the thing going as fast as possible, really. So get the benefits into the business as quickly as possible. I'm a big advocate of turning around the ROI as quickly as I can, and ultimately delivering what it's set out to deliver in the first instance. So, Gordon.
Thank you, Neil. Morning, all. My name is Gordon Kelly, and like my co-presenter has been working in transformation programs for quite a number of years now, mostly but not always based on SAP. And the thing that fires me up, I suppose, about these programs is, in some ways, it's their complexity. My role is often to make sure that the architectural and solution type decisions that we're making do actually meet what the customer and the business need to achieve. And so that's something I find pretty exciting. So looking forward to speaking with you all today. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, thanks both. And we're also joined by our colleague Graham, whose sole focus is data, and who's kindly agreed to dial in from vacation. So thanks, Graham. Graham maybe answer some of the questions that pop up as we progress. Okay, and then I guess just to bring it back to today, linked to that kind of drive to deliver benefits realization and the outcomes at pace that Neil mentioned, this session is all around making sure that data doesn't get in the way of that. Okay, so if we move forwards to the agenda very briefly, how we're going to run the session today, we'll quickly set some context in terms of how data sits within a transformation plan, to make sure we're all anchored in the same kind of scenarios. And then we'll start to go through these critical pitfalls that we want to talk through with you today. We'll start off looking at some of the long lead time, early doors activities, looking at data quality and how to make sure that it started early enough, also looking at establishing data governance, management and control. And then we'll start to have a look at how you bake some of these learnings around data into both your plan and your resourcing for your program, and then start to move into the actual execution of data migration, some of the key things to watch for there around these mock cycles, these testing cycles, data migration, and throughout the whole thing, making sure you have the right level of business stakeholders engaged and good change management throughout. So we're going to kind of go through a little bit of a journey as we walk through those critical pitfalls, and Neil will give us a summary and a wrap up towards the end. As I mentioned, we're going to be just answering questions as we go, as you post them if we can, but we may pick a few at the end as well, time permitting. Okay, moving forward. So I guess to set the context for how we're framing today, we're talking about data migration, data governance and control. And actually much of what we're talking through today is pertinent to any large ERP program, agnostic of application. However, we're going to anchor today's conversation and frame it really in an SAP S/4HANA world. And to do that, so that we're all talking the same terminology, we'll quickly just share with you the key SAP phases for Activate, the methodology that SAP recommends you use, and also how that sits within the program plan. So very briefly, these are the phases and the stage gates which SAP recommend for SAP Activate. From the left to the right, very quickly, discover and prepare are two early phases that you get into, which kind of set the foundational aspects of the program in place. So make sure that the scope, the plan, the budget, the business case, and ultimately the board sanction is in place to proceed. And then when you move into explore, is all really around design. That's the main feature of the explore phase, is getting into the design of the new ways of working and the new systems and so on that accompany that, and realize is actually turning that design into an actual asset itself. So it's both building it, but also starting to test it too and realize. Deploy, as it sounds, is the sharp end, or getting towards it. So that's where we start to get into the activities which really ramp up the engagement with the business. So you start to get into user acceptance testing, training, cutover, and from a data perspective, all of that wrapped into data migration and establishing the control and so on. And then run is actually after you have exited or stabilized, shall we say, the immediate aftercare, the support of the live solution and ways of working. And it's as you start to move into a more business as usual sphere. So some of these terms we're going to come back to time and again throughout the session. And just to give you a sense of how these might underpin a typical, and this is again just an example, an illustrative plan on a page that you might find on a transformation program for a single go live of a program, not the whole thing. You can kind of see those explore, realize, deploy, and run phases illustrated at the top, and some, again, this is just a very high level summary for the purposes of today, of some of the key activities throughout. I think one of the things is worth sharing with you on this one really is that whilst you can see in red articulated what is usually the critical path of most programs, which is driven by the design, the build, and the test of the actual ways of working and the systems as well, the functional side of things, if you will. The data migration activities actually start very early, and they are a close second very often in terms of challenging that critical path. So you may notice underneath the solution build, you actually start to get into these data load 1, data load 2. We might refer to these as mocks. These are test cycles for data migration. And a key thing there to remember is we're actually testing data migration very early during the functional build of the solution of the system itself. So we're going to come back to that shortly in terms of that. That is one of the key things to watch for. So key takeaway really is data migration starts very early and runs all the way through even to post go live of the implementation, and is wrapped around the key activities to do with the solution build. Okay, let's move into these critical watch points. So the first one's really around data quality. So every organization, as they move towards S/4HANA or indeed any chosen ERP, will have some sense of a data quality journey they've got to go through, both extending current data sets and possibly bringing the quality standards back to what they should be already, so that we have a good healthy set of data to move across. First thing to do is to make sure that the scope for data is defined very early in the program. So you want to make sure in the prepare phase, which is before design, that you have a very clear definition of what the different objects are that are going to be in scope for the program. You then want to start to get some analysis on the quality of what is required in your current systems, so that you can start to define the scale and the complexity of how much you need to cleanse or enrich that data. And you need to do that again before design, so it needs to be done in the prepare phase, so that you start to unlock these long lead time cleansing activities. So again, good analysis, good graphics, helping explain what these things are required for, starts to unlock it so that you can do it cost effectively with business resources offshore, potentially even using RPA as an option too for cleanse or enrich, because it's rule-based activities. And then the next aspect of this is you need to make sure that it's clear when those data quality gaps start to impact your plan. this is something that a lot of programs are not very good at. A lot of programs very often have an aspiration to achieve their data quality goals by go live, but that is not early enough. What you need to do really is to set cleanse targets for each key object by each mock cycle, those testing of the data migration routines. So you can see on the right hand side there, we've kind of mocked up what you kind of need to have per object, really, where you have an aspiration, a target to hit a certain cleanse or enrich percentage for each object by each mock, so that you have something. And the key thing here is, do not make it soft or amorphous. That is all too often the case. You need to share it at a steering committee or operating committee level, so it's some sort of a governance forum. You need to have excellent dashboarding so that the impact, the so what of not achieving those goals are understood, because ultimately what these things tend to impact is the ability of the data migration team to perform a full extract, transform, and load as they set out to do for each mock cycle. So good dashboarding is really, really key to this. Then if we actually start to move through and think about, okay, what else do we need to set up very early? Master data governance and management is a topic that most organizations investing in a significant transformation program have on their sites. However, very often they focus on implementing an MDG or master data governance tool set along with the actual system as well. But is that the right early focus? That's the question. We would argue no, because the tool set is just that. In isolation, it's not going to actually create that asset, that data as an asset culture. It's not going to give you the control you need around the maintenance processes. And you actually need that very early on. To avoid your team trying to build on shifting sands, you need to have really good visibility and control of that legacy data within your program during your design or explore phase. So that's how early you need that. Again, this is something that people often think you need to put in place when the system is live, but actually even before it exists in the design phase, you need to have that visibility. You also need to create a pan-enterprise governance framework to make sure that you have an ability to define, control, and maintain the key master data objects, and best practices to appoint master data business owners for each object, which again, before the design phase is very, very useful, because then they can help steer us through design conversations as we go. Again, we need someone with a quick power of veto and someone who is respected and has control of that object. So master data and governance, something that needs to be established in terms of policies and processes well in advance of any solution is the takeaway there. Okay, if we start to move forward then into the actual planning of the program, start to think about that, there's a potential pitfall here that I think is well worth sharing. So if we think about the typical sequential process you have for most programs in terms of their plan, it's well understood typically that the design following on to the build and then the system test and so on is a relatively sequential activity. That sequence of dependencies, I think, is well understood. Perhaps not as well understood, or less commonly understood, should we say, is the interplay with data migration. So what you can start to see here is that as you, and this is just illustrative, you may have more mock cycles for your program, but very typically 3 mock cycles in a dress rehearsal. If we just mock that up on this slide and have a look at it, you can start to see that you do mock cycles during the solution build. And that starts to give you a planning contention issue, because you are planning to migrate to a solution that's not yet fully built. So that's the other challenge. And you can also see that some of these mock cycles feed later testing activities. So mock cycle 2 will feed system integration test. Mock cycle 3 may feed user acceptance test. Again, the numbers of these things may vary from program to program, but usually that feeding of data migration to downstream testing activities is a common feature. So what do you do with this planning contention, which typically arises between, you've got a solution maturity on one side, which is not quite there, but you have data migration wanting to get moving and testing their programs at the other side. Well, the key thing really there is to start to, you can see illustrated in the slide, start to really chop up your build of your solution and make sure your solution delivery milestones for each object are tagged clearly to data migration timelines, that you have an understanding of which objects, which parts of your build need to be in place to enable which objects to be migrated in mock 1, which parts need to be then further built out for you to be able to do mock 2 and so on. So it's understanding those build dependencies, I think, is key. and making sure that the team actually are clear in terms of their understanding of it too. So again, I think that's the key aspect of this, is really making sure that your plan from the outset recognizes that trade-off you always have to make, and you weave your plans and dependencies around it. So we thought about the plan there. Now we're going to think about how that impacts potentially onto resourcing. And with that, maybe if I hand over to you, Gordon, from here, please.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Just before I sort of move on to that, just maybe also draw your attention to some good feedback in the chat as well on the topic, Brian, you were talking about there around master data governance. A couple of questions on the roles that are involved, and I see Graham putting some answers in there. So check that out in due course. But just picking up from what you said, Brian, the next aspect we wanted to talk about really this morning was a pitfall or a risk that exists on programs we find typically around resource and the bottlenecking of resource. And if we think about the migration aspect rather than the governance aspect of data, that's really, we see that quite severely actually on occasion. So the data migration team have typically got a pretty tough job ahead of them in their core delivery work, trying to understand source data, think about the translation of that source data to the future. And they cannot do that work on their own. They rely really strongly on probably two key groups within the program, and that's typically the solution design team. So those resources on the program that are charged with designing the future from a solution and technical point of view. The data migration team really need to interact with those guys pretty regularly, and need to understand how data needs to work in the future. But also typically on a program, we have a business process team or some business people that are seconded to the program to make all sorts of decisions and support the program in many different ways. And of course, they typically have the knowledge of the existing data, how it's used, what we really mean by certain things in the existing system. So the data migration team, who are really, I suppose, experts at the technical aspects, need that strong input from those two groups in order to make the progress that they need to make and to deliver the outcome that collectively that group is trying to do, which is to effectively deliver an agreed design of how things should move from A to B, and also produce a tested migration solution. In the event, and we do see this, in the event that there is a kind of a constraint on that resource, it's possible for two of those groups, the solution design team and the data migration team, it's often possible to think about a way to alleviate that, effectively buy your way out of the problem, perhaps get some more resource running on the program. The business process guys that are on the program, typically that's a limited group in terms of the numbers that we can expect to be given. And also, it's often not really possible to increase the capacity there. You can't buy more people who are experts in the current business and how it runs and the data that they have today. So that's just a kind of a watch out. The typical activities that we see competing for time is that, solution design itself obviously is a really big focus. Business process design for the future. Those business resources on the project are obviously more likely to be thinking about that than, historical data practices and so on. There's a lot of activity happens on the project whilst the data migration team are doing their role around other things too, test preparation, and for the business guys, training and business change work and so on. So we would strongly recommend carrying out specific data migration resource planning on the program and trying to agree where possible a formal commitment from those resource pools on a weekly basis. And that's, easier said than done. We'd also recommend, to assist with that, trying to keep it simple, allocate the right resources for data work. Graham, I'm sure will agree. Data work's not for everyone. When we get down into the detail of it, it's pretty technical. It's really looking at the wiring. So try and keep it simple, and where possible, allocate the right people to that type of work. Inevitably, we see as a program progresses, these constraints kick in at some point anyway. So we'd also recommend having a prioritization model to help handle those clashes when they occur, which is something that we would suggest that even at the best planning can happen. Okay, that's a little bit about in the execution time for the migration teams, what can happen in terms of resources. Brian mentioned a little bit earlier on in the session these test cycles that we tend to run from a migration point of view, mock cycles. And one of the other challenges that we think is pretty common on a program, which isn't immediately obvious, is that these cycles are often seen as something the data migration team are sort of doing in isolation, at least for a period of time. So on the screen, what we can see is a series of test cycles numbered 1 to 3, moving to a dress rehearsal, which is a very formal, final test run through prior to a cutover, and then the cutover itself. So a couple of things maybe to mention about this. You can see on the right hand side that the cutover itself is a narrower window than the test cycles. That's pretty common, and in many ways it's obvious why that might be the case. In early test cycles, you need a bit more time to test things, see how they go. But usually what happens at a cutover window or an implementation window is with a very tightly controlled time period. And so these practice sessions, or these practice cycles I should say, are one opportunity to learn everything we possibly can about the data journey. And we see this as climbing the mountain in stages. And I think a lot of programs we've been on have possibly missed opportunity to learn along the way. One of the things you'll also see on the picture there is a little toolbox sitting in between each mock cycle. It is important to consider that when a mock cycle is run, we're moving data from A to B for the first time, perhaps. We're carrying out transformations, and we're learning things on the way. And we would strongly recommend ensuring that there's some mitigation window in between mock cycles. But as I mentioned, those mock cycles are building to typically shorter, fixed, inflexible windows. So in terms of what we see about that, the insight that we'd expect that people are focused on is not just the first one, which is often the classic one, i.e. learning how successful our migration routines are, but there are other opportunities to gain value from these cycles as well. They're an essential feedback loop into the data quality and cleanse activity. Brian referenced that earlier. Every time we run a mock cycle, we learn something about the quality of our data that feeds back into the plans that we had to assess and cleanse or enrich that data. It's important to see each mock cycle as a chance to bring real information into that. Each of these cycles is also providing a data, effectively real data, that functional testing teams can use. And so that's why in some of the diagrams you've seen Brian present, these cycles are feeding test windows, and that's pretty important. And that's the case throughout the cycle window. We should be keeping that in mind. It's also an opportunity to familiarize key stakeholders with what they're going to need to do in that final cutover window on the right-hand side. So every time we run a mock cycle, we should be trying to do it in the way that we expect to do it ultimately as part of our program implementation. And so it's an opportunity for people to be involved, understand some of these understandably alien concepts for most people, particularly business people. And then finally, it's an opportunity to measure or to get a sense of end-to-end activity timings. And often they're not the technical timings. Typically we would think, oh, we can measure how long it takes to extract data, to transform it, and so on. Very often that's not the limiting factor when we look at the timings in a migration. There is time required to review extracted data and verify it. There's time required to bring people in to look at what we call preload before we load it into the target system, and so on. So every mock cycle we do is effectively opportunity of activity timing, and we talk about trying to start and stop the stopwatch a little bit as we run through those mock cycles. So again, in terms of recommended steps, we would always advocate publishing a detailed cycle execution plan before every cycle, which is what we're going to do at cutover time anyway. So we should be getting into the habit of doing that and trying to measure ourselves against it. We think that implementing formal cycle tracking, including robust defect management. So we know every time we try and load data, there's going to be challenges thrown out, data that was missing, fields that have not been correctly understood or mapped. And it's important to treat those defects within the overall program test controlled processes, right? Treat everything as a defect in the same way that you would for everything else, and have that implemented right from the beginning. We'd recommend publishing daily status dashboards and weekly ones as well, where that's applicable. And again, as I mentioned earlier, ideally, the mechanism we would advocate there is to use the same model that you intend to use later in the program for your actual cutover. Effectively trial running the information that you share outwardly and within the team in terms of the progress of a mock cycle, daily sessions on progress, mitigation actions, and so on. And the second last bullet point there, I think, alludes to that as well. So where possible, manage these cycles as close to the real load processes you can, including things like the meetings you run to discuss them, comms in and out of the team, and so on, because that's going to help people understand how it's going to be done for real. And the final one really is about capturing timings and other learnings. Every phase we do should help us improve the next one. I'll maybe just pause there for a moment because I think we're doing pretty okay on time, and just check whether there's anything going on in the group chat.
I think you're good, Gordon. I think that we've got some questions and answers going to and fro, so I don't think we have any outstanding ones, but some good questions coming through.
Okay. I think the final one from my side really is a risk in terms of the timing of involvement of end users. And by end users in this case, I don't really mean those business people that are on the program, in a seconded fashion, which we've talked about already. Typically, a program will involve people pretty full time. But if we just stop for a second and think about the journey of mock cycles towards a dress rehearsal and a cutover, I've just highlighted on this slide that those final two cycles are different in the sense that we would typically see that they are fully reconciled and fully signed off. Obviously, from a cutover point of view, that will need to be fully signed off, but the dress rehearsal should include a full reconciliation and sign off. And who is it that does that usually? That's often not business people seconded full time to the program. If we think about transformation programs that are implementing SAP, or indeed another technology in a series of geographies or across a number of business units, often you will have business people that are not involved strongly in the program because their roles are quite senior or so on, and they will be the ones who need to agree and sign on the dotted line that the dress rehearsal reconciliation is good, we can proceed to cut over, and of course that the cut over reconciliation is good and we can sign off to proceed into live operation. So just in terms of that, then we're talking about these kind of business unit or end user stakeholders. They're the ones that provide that ultimate sign off and confirm migration has been successful. And for some people that's pretty onerous. I guess for a lot of people it's pretty onerous if we think about the consequences of trying to switch on a new set of ways of working in a system with data that's not right. So they need to have confidence that their data has been fully and appropriately migrated into the solution. And in our experience, people are not afraid to tell you that and explain that unless they're comfortable, they're not signing off. And that's completely reasonable. And so we need to engage them well, and we need to make sure that they have a good working knowledge of the key migration rules that have been agreed. They may be over some of that already, but they also need to be familiar with some of the probably more detailed decision making that often in their role wouldn't be part of their terminology. And so they need to be able to understand what information is going to be provided to them during migration and how they should look at it, how to validate it and reconcile data. If we leave that too late and start sending them a series of, here's a preload report, here's a postload report, are these mappings right? Late in the day, it will be something they're not familiar with, and naturally they'll push back on that. Okay, so in terms of recommendations, we would suggest to try and involve that community as early as possible. So you could be thinking about someone who's a finance director even, right? So they're not going to be full-time on the program, but involving them as early as possible is going to help them understand how the program is going to interact with them. And with that in mind, I think programs need to ensure that that interaction and engagement is high quality, because often there are people who have a low tolerance for poor quality interaction, and also that we're giving them some upskilling as early as possible. So we've indicated there that perhaps mock cycle 2 would be a good window to involve them. That's typically the first full data load, including all data objects. Sometimes the first mock cycle is core master data only. We'd recommend, for obvious reasons, probably that we provide simple and consistent information flows to those people. Again, thinking about the building, going up the mountain in stages, and so that what they're seeing is consistent every time, and they can learn and become more involved in the program almost naturally. This is an important one, really. It is, I think, a good idea to try and secure a hard booking of their time as early as possible. These are the kinds of resources that typically can't delegate their responsibilities. A finance director is not really going to be comfortable often in giving away that ability to sign off on their data prior to switching something on. So trying to secure a hard booking of their time, keeping an eye on obvious things like holiday plans, but other business events as well, other competing things, is very important. Okay, so I think that probably covers that early involvement. Obviously, I'll have a look at the chat as well to see if there's any questions on that, but I'll hand over to Neil now. We've talked a little bit about the things we recommend in the course of the execution right down to go live, and Neil's going to just talk to us a little bit about an overarching and an important topic on scope change throughout the program.
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, so I'm picking up the change management piece. The change management is fundamental pretty much to any program, and I'm sort of hoping that if you're in the middle of a program and you already have a change management process in place, but what we see quite often in terms of lessons learned and indeed projects that go slightly off kilter, should we say, is that we're not taking into consideration data in terms of this kind of change management piece, and there's a lot of blindness in that area. So when we say around change and scoping it around data, we're predominantly talking about the data requirements on the back of the change that's been proposed. So we could have a situation where we have new data coming in. We could have a situation where the data migration process itself has to change because of the particular change request that might have come in. We've got potential data stewardship and data governance issues that we might need to adjust or manage in light of all the change requests, and then we've got the quality of that data coming in as well. And it's very easy for a very simple change to derail quite a significant core data object from loading. And it's really important to consider the timing of all of this as well. So as we've seen previously in some of the slides earlier, the data migration phase runs parallel and certain things happen at certain times, the mock cycles, the load cycles, the preparation cycles. So the timing of that change request and the impact of that change request from a data perspective needs to be all baked into that thinking, because a tiny change actually might not be safe to put live given where you are in the program because of the impacts on data it's having around the edges. So you won't make it in time, if you like, for your acceptance testing from that perspective. So lots of areas where data needs to be involved very quite heavily, if you like, quite detailed in quite a detailed manner, to make sure that it is being considered in the context of a change, however big and however small it might be. And typically some of the best programs that we see, for a start, they start change management early. So this is really key. So and by change management, I mean change management processes within the program, not the business change. So this is internal governance scope change, if you like. Starting those change management principles early is absolutely fundamental. And that includes the early stage designs, the architectures, and all those types of things as well. The earlier you start those, the earlier you start to see the benefits and the impacts of the downstream data as it moves through its cycle, if that makes sense. Second point on this slide is a key point for anybody involved in change management, scope change, etc. in any program. The more simple your process is around change, the more engaged your business are, and the more engaged your program team will be to use that process. The more you can put into that change pot, the more you can filter out, the more noise, if you like, you have to filter through the golden threads and find the right answers. So simplifying the change process is another quite key thing as well, and absolutely make sure the data features in the scoping of change requests is a pretty much no-brainer. It needs a work stream impact, it needs a timing impact, a governance and ownership, data migration, and risk and issues come into this as well. We get a lot of risks that are born from the data world, but actually they're caused by the actual functional world and whatever change might be proposed from a business perspective. And I think the key point here is the passing caps at the bottom of the slide. The data really does need to have a firm seat at the change table. And it should absolutely have a very strong voice in terms of the impact of these things. It's very easy for functional consultants to just say, oh, we'll just turn this on, we'll just turn that on. But actually the downstream and upstream impacts of that data, both internally to the program itself and that world of data, but also to the integrated nature of businesses these days and all the microservices and all the other data that proliferates across the whole business. It's really important that is a holistically considered impact and that it is all considered as part of that particular piece of change. I'm just going to pause and just check if there are any comments around the chat piece on this one before we move on.
I think nothing specific on scope change, Neil.
Perfect. Okay, we'll carry on in that case then. So that probably brings us to the end of the 7 points that we were running through quite nicely in terms of timing wise. So just running through the high-level summary, if you like, to summarize where we are. So point one we said was about starting data early, and data quality in particular early, as early as possible, gaining insight to that information as quickly as possible, so you know where you are today, and then you know the journey you need to take for all of those data objects to get them to a point of getting them ready for the actual load and migration phase from that perspective. Second point we said about was data governance. So we said about prioritizing the processes around data governance and making sure the processes, procedures, policies, etc. are in place. There's ownership, there's stewardship, probably as early as possible in the program. And there's a great question I saw from, I think, Jeremy earlier on in the deck about, is the tool the answer to everything? Basically, the answer is no, it's not. It's just a tool at the end of the day. What makes these things tick is the fact that you've got a process in place, you've got ownership in place, and you've got some management around that particular data aspects. Balance planning is a key one as well. So we all know that the functional build teams, the data build teams, the business teams, they're all busy. Of course they are. They've got a lot to do in the particular realization phases. But you've got to balance that. You've got to balance that realistically and correctly so that the program critical path moves through on its journey as it needs to, unimpinged. Then we talk about resourcing, so I've kind of touched on that a little bit. So the data resource needs to be brought into the program early, and we need to make sure that thing is fully up and running and moving as early as possible, because it does run the entire length of the entire program. Then Gordon touched upon the kind of mock cycle value. So there is no point doing a mock cycle load unless you're learning from it and you're improving the cycle as you iterate through that model. Otherwise, you're just doing it for the fun of it, quite frankly. Your mock cycle and the processes you move through must add value to the next mock. That's the whole purpose of why you do it. You must improve the quality. You must improve the load processes. You must improve the timing. You must improve your knowledge of the data. You must learn continually through that mock cycle, eventually to the point where you're comfortable to sign off that data through the kind of cutover and ultimately the go live and dress rehearsals, etc. Then we talked about end user involvement, so starting to involve the end users as quickly as we possibly can in the context of data. Make sure they have ownership, make sure they understand the criticality of it, make sure they understand the impact of their particular data stream and the accountabilities and responsibilities of data as well. So again, there was a great question that came in earlier about who are these full-time roles, part-time roles? Do they sit in the business? Do they sit in the program team? Again, it's probably a blend of both, actually. But the fundamental is there is somebody on the hook for data, for data, and the end users are involved, and they bring the data on the journey that it needs to go through alongside the program delivery from a program perspective. And lastly, I touched on change control. Absolutely, you must have change control in place. It must include data. And the sooner you start your change control process, even if it's just a light touch change control process at the very outset of the program, you are in control, and you are seeing and you're getting visibility of issues and problems early, enabling you to take corrective action to deal with them and manage them through the process. And obviously we said when any change control that comes up, any scope change, etc., has to be managed and considered in the context of data, both internally to the ERP system and outside the ERP system to the wider ecosystem. So that's a summary of the 7 points that we ran through. Thanks, chaps, for running through those. Great insight there.
I think, Neil, just before we move the slide on, I think just in looking at our timing, and I think we said we would try to field a couple of questions at the end. I think it might be worth doing that just now, really. Is that probably the best thing to do? So I think we've got a couple of questions from the chat. I think we'd maybe received one or two before we even started the session. So perhaps, Brian, I think you were going to pick out one from Class Jan there, and then I'll follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So very good question from Class Jan, which was, what are the most costly and avoidable outcomes for the business when this when it's not handled well in a program? And what's the time of these problems to surface in the business? So I think that's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, share it with my colleagues who can chime in as well. In my mind, Class Jan, there's kind of two aspects to this in terms of the costly repercussions of these things. We've talked quite a bit about making sure that cleanse is in place, that the resources are in place, and all of these things, these kind of many of these early watch points that are all on the screen right now, down to really number 6 in actual fact, are making sure that the execution of the data migration stuff, which, as I said, is the number 2 really just behind functional build in terms of risk to your critical path. Those things can happen on time, genuinely, to the extent that they're aspired to happen, meaning, you know, if you set out to do all of your master data objects in a certain mock, all of your master and transactional in the next mock, for example, you can genuinely do that, and you're not constrained by the quality of data or the availability of resource, or so on and so on. Those kind of things can, unfortunately, cause the kind of impacts on your critical path that can mean the program, and therefore go live, and therefore the entire timeline slips. And in most of these programs, as most of us are aware, the cost of even a single month slippage can be a 7-figure sum, right? Can be really, really significant. So that's the first and early financial costly impact of it. The other impact, which I think is in a much grander scale and much more dangerous, of course, is if you allow these things to slip, and you work around these kind of problems, you don't resolve the kind of issues you might have in data migration, and you work around some of the pitfalls that we've highlighted today, what it can culminate in is a cutover which is very, very bumpy from a data migration, from a data sign-off, from establishing data control perspective. And what that can lead to in the live environment, as many of us might be aware of, is operations which can kind of snowball and gain momentum and become out of control. And those things can be difficult to rein back sometimes. So that is the more costly thing. So what we're trying to do with all of this really is never get to that stage, never become a risk of that happening. Try to make sure that actually what we're doing is we're making sure that the early activities from, again, if I talk about migration, the early activities of data mock migration cycles can happen on time to the quality that we set out and need, and to the extent that we need, so that, you know, as you build on the complexity, we also build the quality, and it becomes safer and safer and safer until eventually you're in the go live cutover, and actually you should be migrating very good, very clean business data that is fully signed off. Hopefully that answers your question, Klashan. There was another one, Gordon, I thought might be good.
Yeah.
For you.
I was just going to pick up perhaps the question from Stephanie there, although I also see that Stephanie's asked a good question. How do you ensure all processes and requirements are captured or addressed in a large scale project? You know, that's a great question. We've got an answer to the question in the chat as well, which is, you know, really well phrased about ensuring that programs have high level anchor points so that all changes are linked back to objectives of the program. Otherwise, it risks program success. And I would completely agree with that post. I think requirements management is, for a large scale program, is one of the most important things to get established nice and early. Brian talked a little bit at the start of the session about the SAP Activate methodology, which includes discover and prepare. And in those early phases, it's worth ensuring that the requirements management process for the program is well established. Often it's not the case that we're just implementing an ERP, whether it's SAP in isolation or something else. Usually there's a collection of products being implemented to support a set of business processes. And so requirements can come from various different directions, from various different process streams. And data, in the context of requirements for data, should be, a bit like Neil mentioned, have a seat at that table, just like everything else. And so what we would suggest is that requirements are formally managed, and that they are the definition of how that requirements management process is established very early in the program, and that you've got an ability to flow from high level requirements early in the program where people don't really have the detail, but they know they want certain things to be in place, down to very detailed requirements. So I know that's not a full answer. What I would say is take this opportunity to advertise some additional sessions. We're running some additional breakfast sessions over the coming weeks and months. And I think things like requirements management and probably how we manage that through the cycle would be something we'd think about for another session. But it's a really good question, because it's a complex thing for a large scale project to ensure it's delivered against its objectives. I think the other thing I see Mike has mentioned as well, I think, Mike, this was probably in respect of the change control process that Neil was talking about. You mentioned simplification is fine, because I think Neil was talking about ensuring that process is simple enough to follow. But you've also mentioned that it should cover the right level of detail, and that's the balance. That's critical. If a change is not assessed in the right level of detail, that's when a problem can slip through. A simple change we think is simple suddenly means that our customers are not loading, and now we have the impact that Brian mentioned, where you have an unintended consequence leading to a 1 month delay, which is making some very senior people nervous. So, okay.
Another good one, Gordon, perhaps if I can maybe just read it out from Jeremy. Graham, perhaps this one might be good for you. So what proportion of programs, let's phrase it this way, would make master data governance part of the ERP program versus a company level self-standing master data governance program? Any thoughts on that, Graham?
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I think, so in my experience, so I can say the last 3 large programs I've been on have actually utilized the ERP project as the governance for the master data governance project. So they've seen it as a hand in hand. And one of the reasons why that's the case is when people look at their ERP solution and upgrading their ERP solution, it's often because of a number of factors, including performance of legacy solutions, including wanting to rotate to something new, leverage new things, new functionalities, etc. So there's actually often quite a bit of a gap between what they're going from and to, as far as solution and also as far as data. And they often recognise, and quite rightly so, that data should be treated as an asset. So the last 3 large programs I've been on have utilised the program to manage their master data governance. But the one thing to get across, it is a business artifact, right? It is something that once delivered is for the business to take on and use, and it starts with the strategy, works through processes, works through standards, works through the org structure, of course, and may end up in a technological solution, or may end up utilizing, for example, just the front end of SAP and S4. But that's how I've seen it over the last few years, certainly.
And I guess, Graham, the ideal, if we could almost pick, it would be wonderful if every program had every client had a pre-existing master data governance tool, set of policies and processes in place, and ultimately we're plugging in a new S4HANA solution and other associated line of business solutions to that. But I guess what we're probably seeing is that combined with the investment in a business transformation and with S4HANA and other things, more often than not, actually, we seem to be seeing master data governance coming hand in hand with it. So it's not that it's our recommendation. It's just a case of, I think, a lot of companies seem to be, coming around to the idea that actually these investments are not worth it, because the value's in the data is the insight, and that's how you make good business decisions.
Yeah, just one quick thing to follow up on that. So from a methodology point of view, we don't start with master data governance strategy. We do a maturity model assessment. Where are you on these items? So we've got an approach for that. And if a master data governance strategy is in place, then it's really important that we look at ways to follow it. And that's the key. It's about making sure that people treat data as an asset. They have clear ownership within the business for the data, and they have ways of managing and maintaining the data. And if that's in place, then all that needs to happen is that needs to evolve to cover maybe additional functionality in their ERP solution. But that's if that's in place, then great. If data was perfect, then great. So all of these things are sort of key sins, as I say, that we try to address or support addressing. So I think that's answered that, hopefully. Maybe back to Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. That's really useful. And Brian, this is one for you that's just bounced into the private chat in my work stream. So it says here, given the importance of to the success of the program, what recommendations do you have to bring to life such a potentially dry subject as data in a steering committee?
Yeah, apologies for that, Graham, the potentially dry. Anyway, yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's key, right? So data can be one of those subjects at a steering committee or implementation board level that people, they kind of glass over when you talk about it, and it feels quite dry, and as long as it's kind of tracking. So it's really important, I think, to be able to bring a short, sharp, kind of what's the impact of us not hitting that cleanse target. it's really hard for business people to understand that. So what you need to be able to do, apart from have some nice engaging dashboarding, I think we showed little snapshots of some of our dashboards that we've been improving and working on because we think it's such an important factor. You know, I think apart from having the excellent dashboarding, you need to be able to distill it down into, okay, so if you don't enrich or cleanse that data, what it means is the extract bit of the extract transform load cannot be tested. We're literally going to push that down the road to the next mock and take all of that risk that when we try to extract the data, we hit a problem. And it's pulling it down into that so what for people that's really important. So I think it's really, you know, you can kind of hear there, I think what's key is, apart from having the dashboards, time and effort needs to be put in place with your steering committee so that they understand the implications of master data governance, of data migration, and how it is not a thing that just needs to get over the line at the end. It has targets along the way, and there are real, genuine impacts on your program if you don't hit them. And it's trying to bring those things to life for people that I think is key. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, absolutely, that's spot on. And like I say, visualization is the key to a lot of that. It's it makes a pretty picture tells 1,000 words. Right, so I think that probably draws us to the end of the session. I can't see any other questions in the chat that we haven't picked up. If there are any questions that come to mind when we have finished, we can always jump on and answer those directly. Just bounce an email out to ourselves. Yeah, thank you very much for your time today. It's been great to have you here. I hope you found the session informative and useful. And as they say in the show, that's all, folks. Thanks ever so much. Have a great day and speak soon.